Hello, good morning. I'm going to introduce the SPS agreement, and basically, this is in the framework of our training sessions on risk analysis. Um, you note that the SPS agreement is one of the tools that can be used in the risk management. Um, and of course, it's got a component of risk communication in terms of maybe notifications and review and things like that. Um, so the discussion on the SPS agreement is basically in this context that there's this training on risk analysis with the components, risk assessments for disease, infectious diseases, pests, chemical, as well as microbiology. The last two falling and the food safety risk assessment. Okay. The module will try and discuss the objectives and principles of the WTO, the SPS agreement, and how it sits into the WTO framework, and then finally the SPS, the scope, the key principles, and the implementation thereof. Okay, so I have the content for your module. WTO is a World Trade Organization um, with 188 member countries. Um, it was established in 1995 and is located in Geneva, Switzerland. It's the only global international organization that deals with multilateral rules of international trade between nations. What's the objective of the WTO? To improve the welfare of the people, that is, the member countries, get the standard of living, employment, income, and this is done by expanding the production of and the trade in the goods and services. Okay, so for objectives in this unit for the space agreement, we will just introduce the agreement. We explain what the agreement structure and scope is, and then briefly touch on the WTO dispute settlement system and some specific provisions in the SPS. Um, we'll list the basic rights and key concepts included in the agreement. Then we explain the implementation. Now, let's start the discussion on the SPS agreement. Why the agreement? Um, we have to answer three key questions when it comes to this. Remember that every country wants to protect its consumers. By virtue of the sovereignty, they have a certain territory to which they have pledged allegiance, pledged the obligation or duty to, to protect that territory. It could be from various things, but let's say look at it from the scenario of food and agriculture and livestock. How do you ensure that your consumers in the country are being supplied with food that is safe to eat? We understand the word safe in that case. So maybe you have a criteria that you'll be using against which you say, okay, now this food is safe to eat. But how do you arrive at that criteria, the standards? How do you set up to say this is the level that we are looking at, and when you reach this level, then you have supplied us with safe food? Okay. Now the third question it comes in. Now, how do we ensure that that criteria that you are using is not just being used as an excuse for protecting your domestic producers? Remember, there's always a question of protection versus protectionist or protectionism. Are you offering protection, or are you having protectionist activities? Are you safeguarding your consumers, or are you safeguarding your domestic producers? So, for example, you can say, we don't want to import um, bananas anymore. So, what's the real uh, motive? What's the real objective behind that? So, maybe we have a very good species of bananas that have not coped well with any other species that come in. So, that could be one. But if, for example, you want to say we we think that we our local banana producers are struggling to compete with the prices being brought by the exporters, those that export into our country. Um, so we want to have a level playing field. So we don't want bananas. So in the context of the SPS agreement, then that becomes inconsistent because then you have posed some restriction on trade, but you do not have justifiable means uh, to be able to do that. It's not something to do with the safety, either of the consumers, humans, or the safety of the species that you have in your country, or the safety of the animal populations that you have in your country. So there's no threat to that. There's no real threat to any of those aspects. And so your decision to ban bananas in the context of the SPS is doesn't sit very well. Okay, so when we deal with the SPS, there are two things that we look into. Do you have legitimate objectives? Yes, we want to protect our environment, we want to protect our consumers. Fine. But are those objectives just discriminatory? Are they justifiable? Um, then now you look at things like, for the justification, are they based on some sound science, or it's just people being driven with emotions, and then they go on to pass on those regulation, rules, standards that are binding, and at the end of the day, trade is restricted, but there's no scientific basis. Let's look at this scenario. Each country, based on the sovereignty um, provision, has the right to say yes to what comes into the country or no. And the measures, if consistent with the three objectives that we've mentioned, to protect animal life or health, human life or health, plant life or health, then they sit in with the SPS measures. But we also need to know that usually there is um, a lot of factors that lead to people imposing measures um, to protect their environment and populations. One of them could be that you have geographical differences. Okay, a cold environment in the northern part of the world, and maybe a warm environment in the southern part of the world may may have an influence on what measures to take. Sometimes it could be so those would be geographical differences. You could also have demographic differences. Maybe the way your populations respond to the uptake of food or anything like that can can be different. We may be exposed to the same risk, but somehow maybe not having the same effects. So you have you have that, but you can also have things like cultural differences, where maybe, for example, in Saudi Arabia, because of the culture, you maybe they may not accept your pork to export your pork in there, um, and and several other examples where uh, there is some way of maybe protecting the population based on the characteristic of your population. So you're saying for this particular population, this is its characteristic, and then if you introduced to this form of hazard, maybe the cost of repairing or the cost of remediation may be high. So as a preventative tool, we will impose these measures saying we are not allowing this to come into our country. Okay, so the scope of the agreement will cover um, the animals, plants, um, and humans, but with respect to food safety issues, toxins, and other chemicals, pests, diseases, and how everything interacts. Okay, we have said this already that the SPS agreement has two aims: to recognize the sovereignty or the sovereign right of the members to be able to provide some level of health protection that they themselves deem appropriate. Okay, so that is parked on the side. But the country will say we have these measures that, and we deem them enough to be able to give us some level of protection that is acceptable. Second, that those measures are evaluated to be able to ensure that they do not pose arbitrary, inconsistent, or sometimes scientifically unjustifiable means of protecting. Um, and in some instances, that could actually be a, a disguise of trade restrictions, where you are trying to um, protect your producers, but you hide in the name of the, the protecting your population. So you have that overlap sometimes. So as long as you don't have any restrictions to the international trade, and you have deemed that measure to be appropriate to give you some acceptable level of risk, then you have um, sat well within the framework of the SPS. You have met the objectives of the SPS. Do not restrict trade, but do not allow your populations or environment to be to suffer consequences due to pests, diseases, or or food safety um, hazards. Okay, so your WTO uh, has its members that the SPS recognizes um, their rights. And then at the end of the day, what the SPS is asking for is, can we have consensus and consistency? Consensus, by consensus we mean What are you using as your means to be able to achieve your ends? Is the scientifically justifiable procedure? Yes. Well, that's fine. Um, Consistency is this measure not discriminatory or just targeted towards certain nations? So that you can remove them out of the trade equation. Okay, so what is an SPS measure? We've talked about the SPS agreement, and these measures have to be consistent with the objective of achieving some level of protection for the human, plant, and animal. But what is an SPS measure? Well, the SPS agreement, for the avoidance of doubt and misunderstanding, also has a section on the definitions, and this is found in Annex A. So you want to read what an SPS measure is, you read it up in the agreement itself. You want to read about what harmonization is, you read it up in the definitions, Annex A. So according to Annex A, an SPS measure is anything that you do to protect animal or plant life or health from the risks arising from the entry, establishment, spread uh, of diseases, pests, disease carrying organisms, disease causing organisms. Um, Also, it's anything that you do to protect your human or animal life or health from risks that arise from additives, contaminants, toxins, or disease causing organisms in foods, beverages, and foodstuffs. So, the third aspect is anything that you do to protect your human life or health arising from diseases carried by animals, plants, or beef products, or from the entry, establishment, and the spread of these pests and diseases. Anything else that you do to prevent or limit any other damage within your territory as a member country, that is an SPS measure. So the thing that we have to remember with the agreement is that the SPS agreement only allows you to apply the SPS measures within your territory. And how do we have these measures? How do they come? In what form? Well, it can include laws, decrees, regulations, requirements, and procedures. It can also include end products testing criteria, processes, production methods, testing. Sometimes you can just say anything that is produced in this particular manner satisfies our SPS requirements, or anything that passes this type of testing or this type of inspection, or anything that has this certification satisfies our SPS requirements. Sometimes you can also even look at things like treatment methods of quarantine, transportation, how you transport your animals, and how do you also do your sampling procedures, your risk assessments, and as well as sometimes labeling requirements. But these have to be directly related to food safety. So, in trying to wind up the introduction to the space agreement, we want to also look at the structure of the agreement itself. How is it set out? So you have provisions that are arranged in articles. Article 1 will have the general provisions. In the general provisions, you are basically just highlighting what this agreement is about, what does it have in the general agreement. You also talk about the fact that the annexes are not informative but normative, that they have to be read together with the document. You may not separate them or remove them from the scope of your of your reading or understanding the SPS agreement. Then the second part, you have the part where now you have the basic obligations and the rights. The SPS agreement does not make you a non-sovereign nation. That first of all, it recognizes that you, as a government or a member country, have the right to protect your community, to protect your environment, to protect your populations. However, ensure that those means have the justification. And usually, the justification that the SPS agreement advocates for is scientific justification. The harmonization is part of it. By that, we mean how do you ensure that you have the same means of achieving your SPS agreement or throughout the nation. So maybe for a start, you have to come together and agree on some procedures that you now pass through an international body as a way of handling that particular scope of the SPS. So, for example, if it is in animal health and life, then you have an international body that will uh, completely be in charge of that scope and produce documents, require for consultations, reviews and comments in the development of the same document that can be standard, rules, guidelines, diagnostic kits, and everything like that. So you have that aspect as harmonization, so that are kind of looking at everything, the risk of this exposure to the pests, exposure to the diseases, exposure to the chemical contaminants with the same lens, from the same viewpoint. Equivalence, so you may have differing SPS measures from different countries. But again, you want to find ways in which you can avoid double, um, doubling the work. Yeah, you can double check on what your friend have done, but you do not necessarily have to double the work. So what that means is that if, for example, country A and country B are not using the international standard, so country B, which is exporting to country A, has to ensure that they document the processes that have been followed in order to arrive at the level of protection that is acceptable for example, to themselves. But they will avail that information to the country that is importing, which will look at the work that was done, and if the measures that were done are okay, then that importing country should be able to accept the measures as appropriate from the exporting country. So you avoid the issue of doubling the work. You can double check on the procedure used, but you do not necessarily have to um, double the work. So that's your equivalence, and then you also have the assessment of risk and the determination of the appropriate level of sanitary and phytosanitary protection. So risk assessment is basically in your Article 5, and it should be the basis for your SPS measure, really. And that is why this SPS agreement sits in very well in this framework of the risk analysis training sessions. That your measures should be informed by some assessment of some kind. or some assessment of the risks that you have identified yeah, as being of interest or concern to you. And an adaptation of the regional conditions, including pest disease-free areas and areas of low pest or disease preferences. So I mentioned this earlier that sometimes the geographical considerations can be made when you're trying um, to, to look at the application of the SPS measures. Some countries may be very prone to certain types of pests and diseases more than the other countries, and all that. So you're just trying to make sure that um, um, you're not being unfair to, for example, those countries that are very prone to certain areas. Otherwise, you may forever say, "We want to trade with you in this commodity." Article 7 will look at the transparency issues. Yes, you have the measure. Where is your measure based? It's based on international standards. So the international standard is already available, and there was already some consultations in that regard. But your measure now is different from the guidelines or the standards that are set by the international body, standard setting body. But what do? You have to notify your people because also the measures may change due to emerging information. So now you want to update your measure, but the other countries need to have a way of knowing that your measure has been updated. Otherwise, they're going to uh, face this trade barrier right at your borders, and your borders are saying no, we cannot allow this meat product. We cannot allow this beef from your country because we have updated our measures. And so now, who, if you're not going to buy from me and I'm already at your border, who takes back my stuff to where I produced it? So you have all those uh, trade concerns. Okay, 8, control, inspection, and approval procedures. Article 9, technical assistance. 10, special and differential treatment. 11, consultations and dispute settlement. We'll do a little bit more on the Article 11 also. And then administration. This is where you find the SPS committee being established. And it is established in Article 12 of the SPS agreement that there shall be an SPS committee. And then the implementation. Final provisions. Um, Annexes, you have 3 annexes. The first one, of course, very important, is that you have the annex on the definitions to be able to just put everybody on the same platform in terms of what are we really talking about. And also, we will have transparency issues. How do you undertake the transparency? The principles of the SPS agreement, there are 7. You want to have non-discrimination. You can find that in Article 2. But whatever you're going to do, uh, even if you have the right as a country to say we will not buy maybe apples from South Africa, but just try and justify that with scientific means so that we do not have a scenario where you're just trying to kick South Africa out of your trading space, and maybe you want to deal with more with the Angola and South Africa. So there should be other means that you can use to address that, but don't use it in terms of a ban. No more apples from South Africa. Why? Why South Africa? So, but if you have enough information to say that actually the form of post-harvest handling activities in South Africa introduce toxins, or the form of agricultural practices in South Africa leave a produce that has pests and diseases that may also just affect other similar crops that we have in the country. So that could be justification. Harmonization. We have to have a way of doing something if not in the same way, at least in a similar way. You cannot um, get uh, people, for example, from two different schools and classes and use their end of term test as a basis for who has done well and who has not done well. As long as you do not ensure that they have written the same paper. So it's the same here. With harmonization, you cannot apply certain measures that are different or not known to another country using procedures that are very different and say these measures would be equal and so they should be taken as they appear. Equivalence is also one of them that look, let's avoid the issue of trying to double the work. We can just end at double checking the first week. So the one of these receiving just double checks if the first week was done properly, and then accepts that. There's no need to double the work. With scientific evidence, here we have now risk assessment. Don't get any measures that have a restriction connotation on trade if you do not have legitimate means. And we have said that in this case, the scope covers things like human health and life, planet health and life, and animal health and life, and anything that you do to protect that from anything that you identify. That is your basis for risk assessment. So do a risk assessment for the microbial, do a risk assessment for the chemical, do a risk assessment for the disease, um, do a risk assessment for the pest. After you've done that, you can now impose your SPS measure. But remember also that even the procedure itself for risk assessment has got to be harmonized. So it's much safer if you use a framework of risk assessment that has been provided by the international bodies. Okay, journalism, yeah, treat everything into context. Transparency, don't shock people with measures. Warn them that something is coming up. So you have a chance where if you have a draft law, maybe in your country, like in this case, maybe in Zambia, if it's a thrown act to be a bill, so that bill has to be publicly available and available also to the WTO members for them to examine the text that you put in there and how it's going to affect them. Yeah. If it's a regulation, we do the same before the publication of that regulation during the drafting period, have at least a minimum of 60 days, 2 months, for people to analyze and to look at the text, to examine it, to provide comment that you have to take into consideration and update your draft. Sometimes, if that provision is not there for people to comment in the draft and you have gone on to pass the law, what you do is that you need to have what is called the transitioning period. So your law is passed today, but you say it's going to come into force maybe 6 months from now. That way, people have a chance to read and they adapt their processes or products uh, in line with now the new requirements for your SPS measures. Yeah, that's how you do it. Then the technical assistance, special and differential treatment for developing countries. So the SPS agreement also recognizes that certain countries like our country Zambia and a lot of those in Africa, first of all, do not have a lot of experts in these subjects like risk assessment. So it may be very difficult for them to really have a good framework for implementing these measures. But also, you have issues to do with the um, availability of resources. So because so resources are very limited, so maybe risk assessment may not be a priority there may be some more pressing needs. So they may not, for example, have that luxury of sending some expert from Zambia, uh, from your country. It could be an agency dealing with livestock, an agency dealing with pests, or an agency dealing with food safety to be able to sponsor you to go to the meetings. They may not have that amount of disposable resources. So it may be difficult to be able to really participate at that level. So the SPS agreement has various provisions that allow them to treat such a scenario on a case to case basis to ensure that nobody is left out in this agreement to be able to continue to, to trade. Also, maybe it can fall in the first part also, but um, sometimes the capacity to actually confirm that these products are safe uh, may be limited. For example, um, there may be some sophisticated tests that you may need to do, and maybe you may not have those laboratories in your country to be able to test that. So you find that for you to verify that this particular chemical is actually not present in our food, maybe you have to send your samples to Germany, USA, or the UK, and so you may have some challenges really to be able to effectively implement your SPS measures because you will not really know that what we are accepting for our consumers is actually safe. Okay, member countries that are adopting the SPS measures should not make any arbitrary or unjustifiable discriminations. Um, this should be done um, um, using uh, principles that are uh, accepted internationally. Just try and ensure that this country that is imposing these SPS measures is not using that to disguise uh, as a disguise, for example, on trade restrictions. So we don't want to deal with South Africa. So we just say no more maybe fruits and vegetables from South Africa. What's the scientific justification for that? Maybe you find that there's really harmonization. You want to promote free trade. Remember that the SPS agreement just wants to have free trade, and anything that is a barrier to trade uh, is what the SPS is trying to address. And then you have this legitimate means to protect your populations and the environment. But for you to arrive at that, you may need to demonstrate that you have followed international protocols. What is harmonization? Like we say, it's the establishment, recognition, or application of common set, sanitary and phytosanitary measures by different countries. So the commonality is achieved by this harmonization process. Um, you remember that the harmonization is by some standard setting bodies that are international. And these draw their members from the member countries in which this may be applied. So there is some input into the document, and there's also some expected uh, obligation to follow that past document to the fullest. Okay, now also part of the harmonization process is that there has to be a way of recognizing which are these bodies that are international. So the SPS agreement makes mention of three organizations. One is the Codex Alimentarius Commission. The second one is the IOE. And then the third one is the International Plant Protection Commission. So the Codex, the World Organization for Animal Health, and then finally the IPPC, and they are called the Three Sisters. So you have the food safety concerns covered by Codex. You may recall that Codex is a body or a program that is run jointly by FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, as well as the World Health Organization. The animal health concerns are handled by the OIE, the uh, and then the plant health is handled by IPPC. So, just a bit of information also. Codex is intergovernmental and it has a joint management by FAO and WHO. OIA is also intergovernmental, but is not part of the UN. IPPC is administered by the FAO. Who are the members for Codex? Governments who fall under FAO and WHO mainly. OIE, you have the governments, and then the IPPC, you have governments and also, um, but those would also accommodate non-FAO members yeah, as full members. Membership, yeah, just around 180, above 180 for each and every one of them. The standards, Codex will produce commodity standards, guidelines, codes of practices, pesticide residue, that is the MRIOs, as well as the veterinary drug residue limits. While the OIE will give you the terrestrial code, for example, the diagnostic tests, um, uh, uh, same for IPPC, it will give you the international standards on phytosanitary measures. They've adopted quite a bit. Shortly, we handled the aspect of who Codex Alimentarius Commission is. It's a joint FAO WHO food standards program, and it was created in 1963 to develop food standards guidelines and codes of practice. The purpose of the Codex Alimentarius Commission is to protect the health of consumers and ensure fair trade practices in the food trade. They also promote coordination of all food standards work by international governments. Um, the OIE is a formerly the Office International de Epizootis. Um, it's a global standard for animal health issues. It's not an FAO or WHO organization, and then the countries which belong are required to report outbreaks of the listed diseases. What's the purpose of the OIE is to safeguard world trade by publishing health standards for international trade in animals and animal products. IPPC is a multilateral treaty for international cooperation in plant protection. It, its purpose is to secure common and effective action to prevent the spread and the introduction of pests of plants and plant products, and to promote appropriate measures for their control. So that's why they also have standards on the phytosanitary measures to, to use. Article 4 of the SPS will give you the equivalence uh, provisions. And in this article, it is recognized that more than one SPS measure can be equally. Article 4 um, of the Sps Agreement recognizes that more than one measure in terms of SPS legitimate objective can be effective in satisfying a country's appropriate level of protection, which in some cases is called the the acceptable level of risk. The burden of proof for equivalence is the exporting country. The exporting country has to demonstrate that, for example, Zambia now is a FMD disease um, uh, free zone, FMD free zone, the foot and mouth disease free zone. So once you have done that documentation, then you send it over, maybe, for example, to Botswana, who want to import your meat products or even your meat. Now, Botswana has to check if your documentation has demonstrated that your measures that you have put in place are adequate. They are sufficient to to arrive at that. So once that is done, then you can accept the measures of a different country. Uh, um, that is that. So maybe, for example, you have these measures that you do, maybe to protect one region which has a disease tag or pest tag from the other. So if you're able to demonstrate that there is no way of anything coming from the country being bundled as one, then they may accept your measures as enough. Scientific evidence, we are looking at the risk assessment, and this definition is given in the Annex A on Part 4. Okay, the starting point for risk assessment is that food safety, animal health, plant health must take precedence over trade. So you can't trade in something that has a chance of passing on health consequences to the consumers, or trade in some commodity that has a chance of spreading pests and diseases in your country. So that should be taken as a first criteria before you trade. Is this commodity safe for our consumers, safe for our animal populations, safe for our plant populations? Yes, then you can trade. But when that question is not answered in the affirmative, then you need to demonstrate now uh, that there has to be safety requirements. Um, Now, the SPS measures that you do should be based on the assessment to the risk to human, animals, plant, life, or health. So you may take your measures based on the assessment that you have undertaken to check the exposure um, and to check the risk resulting from the likelihood of that hazard you have identified being present, and also the exposure to your subject. Maybe it can be the plants, it can be the animals, or it can be the humans that are consuming. So the three sisters that we mentioned, the IPPC, the OIE, and the Codex, they will give you some guidelines for undertaking risk assessments, and it is what you should normally use to be able to arrive at a conclusion of your risk assessment, and then maybe you can now do your management. In case there is a significant risk, then you do management issues and communication, of course. So the risk assessment coming from an importing country uh, can rely on assessments made by another country as long as there is um, some appropriateness in the risk assessment that was undertaken. Okay, so for pests or diseases, usually the framework would be that you evaluate the likelihood of entry, establishment, or spread of the pest or disease. And then you also try and assess the associated potential biological or economic consequences. Yeah, sometimes it may be issues to do with the suppose we allowed a diseased animal into our country. Do we have means or mechanisms of bearing the costs that would be involved in terms of containing the spread? Or do we have enough resources that can guarantee that enough uh, quarantine quarantining is done? So sometimes if you do this potential assessment of potential consequences, you may choose to say, okay, we won't deal in this because we don't have enough resources to be able to deal with the consequences once we get it. So, from the point of view of us not having enough resources, we will rather not even deal with it from the word go. For your food safety, you are looking at the potential for adverse health effects on your human or animal health. In this case, you're also dealing with things like feed. And this can arise from the presence of additives, contaminants, toxins, disease causing organisms in your food or beverages or feed stuff. In the same article for risk assessment, there is an article 5.7 which talks about provisional precautionary measures. This is based on the famous precautionary principle, which says that if you have some information that something is bad, but you don't know in what context it is bad, then you are allowed not to deal with it based on the information that it is bad, uh, even if you do not have information on how bad, um, how that bad quality can affect you. What we mean is you will not do the exposure assessments and then and everything, but you just remain with the fact that we know for sure that this thing coming to us has got this thing which is hazardous to us. So we will not deal with it, even if we do not find a way of checking how exactly is that hazard transferred maybe to the humans or plants or pests. So precautionary principle is the safety first kind of approach. Before we can do discussions, wait there. Yeah, even if yeah, I will listen to you later, but for now, wait. That kind of scenario, and it gives you a chance to protect your populations while you're gathering information. And then once that is done, you can now say, okay, I think based on this information they have, it's okay, you can come. A practical example of this is the steer case in South Africa, when through the Ministry of Health, we said no more meat products from South Africa, and I think the big emphasis was on the Polonis. We just said any meat products coming from South Africa, we're not buying because we've got the steer problem. Okay. Now, as that ban was done, information was being gathered. Then it emerged in the information that it was not every meat product. It was just one producer and in one of his sites that had that problem. So now, based on that, then you review and say, okay, I think now we've established that it's also the problem, so that one's been confirmed. So you can bring back you can start bringing back the meat products in the country. That's a very practical example of a precautionary principle that you say, I do not have information, but I'm saying I'm not attending to anything at the moment until I have information. Then once I have information, I can say one, two, three meat products, you can now come in. But at first, you have put a stop to any meat products coming from that particular place. So the common elements of the precautionary principle are that, first of all, you have to have information about a real threat being posed by something. You don't want to guess that it could be dangerous, because if we are allowed to guess that everything is dangerous, then we may not trust each other. But you have to have a real reason to base your argument. Okay, there's actually a real threat of harm found in this. How much of it I do not know. I don't have that information, and there's nobody else that has that information. So that is the second part, that there should be some lack of scientific certainty or scientific information. Certainty can sometimes be coming from the point of view of there's some information that is parallel. These scientists are saying this, the other scientific bodies are saying this, but it's not coming to a form of consensus. So you want to use that and say, okay, I'm not too sure, because it's not going to be a guesswork. If I go with this scientist and then I discover that the other scientist group was right, then I would have affected my community. So where there is contrasting voices or opposing voices on a scientific subject, then you can use that as uncertainty. Yeah, because uncertainty is, of course, just not being sure. And this is the aspect of risk, that the best way of looking at risk is that it's the effect of uncertainty. What's the risk of me uh, getting pregnant? Well, I'm very sure I can get pregnant because I'm a man, so there's no risk. But if I was a woman, then I'll start looking at what ways am I exposed to that possibility. So there's a probability, and then now you have now the consequences. Of course, if it's not a good thing, then you have to look at it as a risk issue. What's the risk of me drowning? Well, I rarely go go to pools of water or rivers or anything. So but if there's some likelihood that I usually go, then you say, okay, the likelihood is maybe one. I go sometimes, or the likelihood is high. I go maybe most of the times, most of the weekends, and that is what happens. So for that now, for anything that you have, if you don't have any information for sure that this thing will happen like this, then it's risk, because you don't know how that aspect of you not knowing can affect you. What's the risk of it being um, Wednesday tomorrow? There's no risk. We know it's going to be Wednesday tomorrow. But what's the risk of power going right now and this production is cut? Well, I don't know for sure. I don't know if there is going to be unlimited power. So because I don't know, then I can take that into the risk consideration. Say, okay, there's a chance that power will go. So maybe I'll look at the records. How many times does power go at this place, University of Zambia, and then use that in my calculations. When it goes, what's going to be the consequences? Maybe we don't have a backup, so it's going to be real serious consequences. The production will stop immediately. So you do that analysis. So I was trying to just contextualize the issue of risk, that you have a certain threat that is there. But how much information do you have about if that threat is likely to get into your way? And if it's going to get into your way, through what means? And how are you predisposed to those means? Let's look at a small example. I think we discussed this in the chemical risk assessment, but let's look at the issues of aflatoxin in maize. So maybe a country that has maize as a staple, staple food, will have a lot of considerations um, for the risk of getting aflatoxin in maize than a country that maybe eats maize occasionally. Maybe in Zambia, in fact, there are people maybe that we know that everything that they eat during the day will be maize based. Maybe in the morning they'll have some porridge, then maybe afternoon they'll have shima or something. Maybe now that it's the rain season, at 18 hours they'll have a cup of maize. At 20 hours again they'll have another shima. They may even have some snacks in between. They'll buy corn snacks. They'll also be maize-based products. So the exposure to the to the hazard of aflatoxin, if it is actually established that it's there in Zambia, is high for the Zambian population. But you have to be able to determine that this hazard we're trying to avoid or manage or control is actually there. So in the precautionary principle now, to get back to the precautionary principle, you have identified that this is a threat that can harm us. So we want to protect ourselves from this harm, but we don't know how this harm can really be transmitted to us. But we just know that the harm is in this commodity. So we'll not deal with this commodity. We will not deal with all commodities from this region. Precautionary principle should be based, should be used to prevent harm. You can't use it to control harm. So you can make some form of risk assessment with very little information. And then right there in your assessment, you have to declare that yes, we understand that information is very scanty and may not be very accurate. So we'll go with this decision for now to protect our communities, but we will, of course, with time, try and ensure that we compensate for this uh, lack of information we have. And then in the closing remarks for precautionary measures, we're saying that whenever you adopt these precautionary measures, try to ensure that the while you understand that the scientific information is not a lot, and that's your basis for your available information, uh, you have to kind of pledge or promise that you seek additional information. So you try to engage relevant scientific bodies to update that information that you have, and then based on that, have a review period that is reasonable for you to be able to say, okay, for now we have banned maybe, for example, all meat products from South Africa, but it's not a ban that will stay for 5 years. We'll say maybe this ban, we will be reviewing it after every month to check if there's any information that allows us to maintain this ban. Because remember that your measures have to be scientifically justifiable. So a precautionary measure is temporal in a way. You have to maintain it with information that comes and suggests that actually what you did was right. In the absence of new information coming to update your old information or your old basis of measures, you have to withdraw it. Then it's neither here nor there. But if the information has come and it's telling you that yes, there is a this spread of this hazard from this area, but there are pockets of this area that have shown that they are not affected by this, then you can be doing those areas and remove the ban on the whole country. Like we did for listeria, the first was to ban all meat products from South Africa, and then Finally, now just saying, okay, it is this producer, and finally in this region where the problem was. Now we are able to get some more meat products from South Africa. Your appropriate level of protection, what that means is that you have an opportunity as a country to do what you feel is necessary. But remember, you are looking at is this measure going to adequately deal with the risk? By dealing with the risk, I mean, is it eliminating the risk, or is it just reducing the risk to acceptable levels or tolerable levels? You can say, okay, I think for this one is good. Um, there was an example that was given, I think, in the other class that, for example, you want to park your vehicle at a mall. So at the mall, you have a poster that is written saying, "Park at your own risk." But this is East Park Mall. There will be some security people that are passing, but they've just said that they do not have that um, legal obligation to compensate you. So they'll say, "Park at your own risk." So when you are parking your vehicle there, you look at the sign and then you assess, is it fit to park in here? Maybe the chances of somebody stealing this guy is very, very low. First of all, there's a lot of people around, then there's a bit of security people going, and yeah, maybe difficult to really have um, the likelihood of that happening is very low. But if, for example, you went to a place like in Osaka, maybe Chibodia, and there's even a sign there saying park at your own risk. If even just parking there without that sign, not so many people may easily park there because, but where there's even a sign saying park at your own risk, um, you may not be able to accept that risk. But for the more, there's a sign saying park at your own risk, but you have still parked. You have accepted the risk. Say, I think the likelihood of somebody stealing here is very low. So the risk is there. I know I've been told, somebody has communicated to me, but I will accept that. I think maybe even convictions have said, I think maybe should that happen now, there's some insurance against you. But sometimes maybe even these insurance bodies will tell you where was your insured product, uh, where was it when it was stolen? Then maybe you are impacting high risk area, so maybe you may have different considerations. Okay, so when you are assessing this risk to the human or plant or animal health, you need to apply measures that you deem fit to be able to, to reduce the risk to what is called acceptable level of risk. And like I said just a few seconds ago, that sometimes uh, um, it may just be as good as saying, okay, I know this thing is there, but I'll accept it the way it is. Like maybe you accept parking at the mall, but there's a sign that you park at your risk. Okay, regionalism, you have to adopt measures that are characteristic to areas or even part of the country where you are from. Um, so if this part of the country is prone to certain types of diseases, you may want to use measures only in that certain area and leave the other areas a little bit free, because there's some difference in the characteristics of the area. So maybe that's one area. There's a lot of preference. That the prevalence rates for certain pests and diseases are generally naturally higher. So you will not use the same measures. Yeah, yeah. Um, okay, yeah. So for example, you can also talk about issues of rain. In certain areas, it may be inappropriate to go with an umbrella because of how the rains are. And in certain areas, you may probably just need to get a full gear raincoat, gumboots for you to be able to still do your work. Okay. Do you have any eradication control measures or programs? Yeah, that could also be taken into context for journalism. Ebola is very prone in our neighboring Congo, so maybe the measures may be different from the way we handle Ebola here as an emergency in the country. Okay, then accept whenever there is a concept of this now is now an Ebola free area, it's now a pest free area, disease free area, then you need to accept that concept. But of course, the burden of proof will be on the exporter. He has to prove that where I'm coming from, we don't have pests and diseases, so you can accept my kettle, you can accept my rose flower. Look at the report for documentation. Okay, so the other one is technical assistance, and then the special and differential treatments, uh, and then now we will end with transparency. And by transparency, we mean that because the measures that are taken by different countries are either complex in the way they are designed or complex in the way they come, because maybe there is updation of information that comes. There's need to avoid the trade shock where I come with my goods, I'm at your border, and they're telling me that no, we don't accept goods from this part of the country because it's in our SPS measures that you will not get maybe cattle from Botswana. But I had no information. I just brought, and then I thought last week I brought, this week I've brought, but the measures, the law has changed. The concept of transparency comes in to remove that. That each member country now has a transparency and notification obligations. By transparency, we mean that the information that you have, is it readily available for people to know if they're going to bring stuff into your country? They should be able to know what are the requirements, and the requirements are updated and current. But are you also able to tell them that, okay, whoever wants to bring cows from today onwards has to make sure that they have undergone this and that. So you want to have a way in which people can tap into your information system, but you're also able to broadcast that information somehow. So the members have to notify other members of any new or changed sanitary measures which could affect trade. Secondly, they have to be open to scrutiny. So you notify, but your notification is not final. You say, going forward, we will not be getting in cattle from Congo, for example. Um, so before you actually start enacting, you pass that intention of regulation. If Congo brings information to say, no, but the disease you're talking about has not been detected in this country. So where's your basis? You need to take into consideration the comments that you get. Or maybe they'll say the disease is there, but you also have that disease in your country. So what's so special about you telling us not to get stuff from us that you consider diseased, but you also have that disease in your country? So what's the justification? So you can have such scrutiny, but you have to be open to such scrutiny because it's not like once you've made an intention, then you've got to implement it. You've got to take into considerations the comments that are coming from the member countries. Remember, this notification will be sent to the WTO Secretariat that will broadcast to the member countries who will now have the opportunity to examine your text and then make comments. Secondly, you need to also ensure that you have some inquiry points um, that will be available for people to come and check whatever is there that is obtaining in your country, and they want to maybe trade with your country or to export into your country. Okay, so the slide shows you a small picture that the members shall establish inquiry points Inquiry points will be depository of information about any SPS measures that your country is implementing. And then you do also need to set up a designated notification authority. The notification authority will interact with the various agencies that are maybe in charge of animal health, plant health, or even human health, and then be able to notify the member countries of the WTO on anything that has changed or become new in terms of legitimate measures to protect the human, animal, plant life, or health. You shall notify other members of the new or changed SPS regulations when, uh, and this is a scenario, that first of all, try and assume that this information is available within the standard setting bodies, the three sisters. If that information is not contained in any of the standards that they have produced, then you can pass that regulation, SPS measure, because it's not contained in any of the standard setting bodies. So it will be something that you have to notify the other countries. But then if your regulation is somewhat different from an existing standard passed by Codex, passed by IPPC, or passed by OIE, then you also need to make that notification. But of course, everything that we have discussed is in the context of is it in any way restricting trade? The inquiry points, you have an opportunity to provide answers and documentation for anything that is related to um, um, any SPS regulation that you have adopted or you propose to within your territory. So you can have one or more inquiry points. I think in the Zambian context, we have three inquiry points. The animal health is under the Department of Veterinary Services. The plant is under the Ministry of Agriculture, but under the Department of ZARI for plant quarantine and the phytosanitary services. For food safety, you have the Ministry of Health itself. The notification authority, you have the Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry as our national notification authority. So all notification of proposed SPS measures are sent through the Ministry of Commerce, who will now broadcast to the WTO Secretariat. Okay, now if you're going to have a way of being transparent, the question is at what stage do you notify? So you have different scenarios. One, as you're drafting a regulation, you have a draft text or bill or draft statutory instrument. You need to have a 60-day period where you send that draft for other members of the WTO countries to examine the draft and to comment. So the comments that come as a result of that review in that 60-day period have got to be taken into account as you are updating the draft. So at the end of the day, you have a law or regulation or decree or procedure or standard or any requirements that have already had a global touch to it. There's been some input from the members of the WTO. Emergency, you pass immediately. And usually this happened in the COVID scenario. Of course, maybe a little bit different from what we're discussing, but you have cases whereby you pass a law, there is no information, and then you just want to make sure that you limit the exposure to the hazard. So that's a case of an emergency. You implement the SPS measure immediately without that. But of course, that also means that you need to to seek to obtain more information. So now we can update that measure. Say, okay, this measure can be kept, or this measure now can be dropped. I think new information suggests that it is not as dangerous as we previously thought. But there's the other option where now you say we will pass this law, but we will have a 6 month grace period or transitioning. We will pass this regulation, but there will be a 6 month where a period where people will have to adapt their processes or products to meet these measures. Because the measures can be things like we want to up the requirements that are found in the codex. So where codex was saying maybe um, maximum is a 10 ppm, but for our country, we think that because we are highly exposed to this, so our maximum now has been brought to 2 ppm. So we have heightened the requirement. We have made it higher. Um, and because of that, now we will notify and say the law has been passed, but everybody else has 6 months in order to tune their processes to ensure that the processes themselves comply or the products that are produced thereof comply. So for today's session, we will end here and we will continue from the dispute settlement framework of the WTO. Thank you.